Hello! Okay, so today we are going to be building Wordle in Excel. If you've not played Wordle, it's a word guessing game in which you are given clues along the way as to whether or not you've guessed a correct letter and whether or not it's in the correct place. As you can see, we're going to try and make it look as close to the real Wordle as possible, but there is quite a lot to get through, so this may be split over 2 or 3 separate tutorial videos. Let's get started. So let's have a think about how Wordle actually works. First of all, we're going to have a word that we're searching for. And we're going to put that in here across these 5 squares. So let's just say, for example, we've got the word C-L-O-U-D. We then get 6 chances to guess what that word is. So if we have our guess here, and we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this section will be our guesses. And I think to make this obvious, let's put some borders around it. And let's do the same for this. And then finally, we're going to have our result. And what this section is going to do, it's going to look exactly the same as the guess section, except this is just going to give us an output based on whether or not the guess is correct. So what we'll have is this will show a 0 if the letter is not in the word at all. It will show a 1 if the letter is in the word but is in the wrong place. And it will show a 2 if we've got a correct letter in the correct position. So just to make this a little bit nicer to look at, let's make all of these center aligned. And let's change the sizes slightly to something more resembling squares. Okay, so the functionality we want here is that if the guess was, for example, audio, always a good starting word for Wordle, we would say, okay, look at this A. Is this in the word at all? That would be a 0. The A is not in there. Then we look at the U. Is the U in the word? It is. But is it in the right place? Is it in position 2? No. So that's would be a number 1. Same for the D. The I would be a 0. And the O, again, would be a 1. Now, since I've got the O, U, and D there, I might figure out that that goes at the end of the word. So perhaps my next guess would be proud. And then same again for this, we'd go through with a 0 for the first 2. And then we've now got the O, the U, and the D in the correct position. So they would all be 2s. So this result table down here is really what would guide how the results board shows our colours, whether or not it's a grey for nothing, an amber for a letter in the right place, or a green for a letter in the correct place. So let's have a think now how we would code this up. So I'm going to go to the Developer tab, Visual Basic, and I'm going to insert a module, and let's just call this module Game. While I'm here, I'm going to rename this sheet. Let's just call this Calcs for calculations. And I'll do the same actually on the Excel file. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to code up is the checking of a letter. So let's create a function and call this check letter. And what we want to do is we want to give it a letter as a string, and we also want to give it a position that is in, and we're going to return either a 0, a 1, or a 2. And let's just comment what this is going to do. we're going to want a row number that the solution is currently on. And you can see that will be row 4. And we're also going to want a column also as an integer for us to check. So let's say the row solution equals to 4. And then first let's check for a perfect match. So we want to say, okay, if calcs.cells, and we're going to reference the row of the solution and the position, if that is equal to the letter, then we know we've got a perfect match and we can exit the function. So for example, if we had an L in position 2, this would find that to match, it would return a 2 and it would exit the function. If it doesn't exit the function, then we're going to move on. So we'll say, okay, if not a perfect match, let's check for a partial match. So for this, we're going to loop through all of the positions and just check if the letter is in there at all. So to do that, let's say, okay, for colsolu equals 1 to 5. And then we can say next column. And here we basically want to check almost the same thing. So we're going to say, okay, if calcs.cells, and this is going to be our row and our column, dot value equals letter, then the check letter will equal to 1. And then we'll exit. And I've just realized we've missed out dot value here. Okay, so now we're going to check for a perfect match. We'll check for a partial match. We know that if it's come through this loop and it hasn't exited the function, then it hasn't found a letter at all. So therefore, we're going to say, okay, if the function hasn't been exited, we're going to return 0 because there is no match. So now check letter will just equal 0. So now we have this function, we can test it out in the immediate window down here. So let's just go, we'll say debug print, and we'll check letter. And let's check the letter O, for example, in position 2. Now we know this should return 1 because O is in the word, but it's not in the correct place. It's not in position 2. No. Let's just correct col to colsol. And try that again. There we go. So we get 1 for that. If we have O in position 3, then that should return a 2, which it does. And then finally, if we have a letter that's not in there, R in any position, we get a 0. So we know that's working correctly. The next thing to do is to program that into a full guess. Okay, so let's create a new sub here called check guess. And this is just going to take in the row from our sheet that we're checking. Okay, so a few variables we're going to need here. Let's do the column that we're checking, which will be an integer. The result of the check, also an integer. And the row that we're outputting to, which will also be an integer. Now we know that the row out is always going to be in line with the row that we're checking. So let's just have a look on here. If we're checking row 9, for example, the first guess, we know that the result will go in row 19, and for row 10, it will go in row 20. So basically, we can add 10 onto the row that we're checking to get the row that we're outputting to. So therefore, let's just say row check plus 10. And now we're going to check against each letter to say, okay, let's run this through our check letter function. We'll get the result, we'll put it in our result grid. Okay, so again for this we'll use a for loop. And we can say again 1 to 5. Okay, so let's think about how this will work. We're going to say, okay, the check result, we want to run our check letter function. We're going to be checking column 1 of row 9 to get the letter. So for that, let's say calcs.cells, and then the row is going to be row check. The column is going to be column check. And then we'll say dot value. And then the position again is going to be col check. We then want to put this result into our result grid. So let's say, okay, calcs.cells. And this is going to be, the row is our out row, and the column is the check column, and that's going to be equal to check result. Okay, so again, let's use the immediate window down here to check if this works. So let's say we'll call check guess, and the row that we're going to call it on is going to be row 9. So let's put back into row 9 up here, audio, as we did before. Okay, and then let's run our check guess on row 9 and see if this works. Okay, so that's output the result that we're expecting, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1. And that is obviously the equivalent of a grey square, 2 ambers, a grey and an amber on the Wordle board. And let's do one more check. Let's move this to proud that we had before. And then we'll run the code again with row 10. And just to check this second one works, we now get 0, 0, 2, 2, 2. So that's working great. Right, so the next function that we need to create is something that's going to check what the game status is. So has the player won, has the player lost, or if neither of those, continue the game. So let's create a new function and we'll call this, maybe check a game status. And we're going to input, again, the current row that we're on. And for this, we can just return a string, which will feed back to us what the game status is. Okay, so we're going to create our column check integer again. We're going to use the same for loop, so for column check 1 to 5. And for each of the columns and the values, we want to check, is this a 2 in our result? Because we know that if they're all 2s, then the player has won the game. So let's firstly check for a win. So we're going to say, okay, if calcs.cells, and we're going to be, the row we're checking, again, is going to be row check plus 10. Because if we're currently checking, if our guess is row 10 for proud, the row we are checking is the result row, which is row 20. So row check plus 10, and then our column. And for each one, we want to say, okay, if the value doesn't equal 2, then we know that the game has not been won. So actually we're going to need a new variable here called game status just to track that. And we'll set this for now to continue. And exit 4. And the way we'll work this is before we start this loop, we'll set the game status equal to win. Because then we know when we get to this stage, if the game status remains at win, all of the values are equal to 2, so the game has been won. If one of the values is not equal to 2, the game status will have been changed to continue. So let's just add game status up here as well as a string. So now we can check to see if the game has been won. Now, if we know that the game status is not win, so let's say if game status doesn't equal win, then we want to check if the game status is that the player has lost. And the way we're going to know this is that if we are on row 14, which will be the final guess row, so if we're now checking this row and it's been filled in and the game has not been won, that therefore means the game has been lost because the player has no more guesses remaining. So all we need to say here is if our row check is equal to 14, then game status, say, equals lose. And then finally, all we need to do here is we can return the value game status, which will either be win, continue, or lose, depending on those checks. So we've called this function check game status. So we just say check game status equals game status. So let's just try that out in our immediate window. We'll print out debug.print check game status, and we'll check row 10, and we get continue. So that looks like it's also working. So our next stage is going to be trying to make this more into a usable game. So let's think about how this would work. A player would enter their guess, and they would press a button. It would calculate the result, and then it would check the game status to see if the player gets another go, or if they've won, or if they've lost. So let's think about what that button press would need to do and code that in. So let's create a sub just called make guess. And this is going to be the action for when the player presses a button. Now, for this to work, the game needs to know which row we are currently on. So to do that, let's create a row counter here. So we'll say row, and we'd normally be starting on 9. So let's just delete these guesses. So this would be our normal starting position. And we'll just need to make sure that now we keep track of whatever row we're on in this cell. So now when we're making a guess, we can call our check guess function. And we know that just takes in a row. So we can say, okay, the row it's going to take in is calc.range, and we can just call the range itself, which is H9. So that's now checking row 9. Once we've called the check guess, oh, and I missed a closing bracket there. Once we've called the check guess, we can check the game status to see, based on this guess and based on this row, what is the game status. And since game status returns a string, let's create a game status string. And then we can say, okay, game status equals to check game status. And again, the argument is going to be the same row that we've just checked. So it's going to be this H9 value on calcs. We can then say, okay, if the game status equals win, then do something. Else, if the game status equals lose, then we can do something else. Else, the game status is going to be continue, and we'll do a final thing, and then end if. So let's have a look what we're going to do here. If the game status is win, let's just message box out to the user, very simple, you win. If it's lose, we'll say you lose. Now, if this game status is continue, what do we want to do? We want to move this row counter on and let them have another go. So essentially, all we're going to say is that the range from above here, the calcs range H9, that is going to be equal to H9 plus 1. Okay, so let's just test this out briefly. Let's put in back here our guess audio. And let's call make guess, see what happens. Okay, so it's output our result. The row has been increased because it knows that the game status is to continue. So let's try to go PROUD. It now knows we're checking row 10. So again, let's call in the immediate window down here, make guess. And you can see it's populated and we've continued to row 11. And then let's finally now put in cloud. And we'll again click make guess. And we get you win. Okay, so that all seems to be working fine. We obviously need this make guess assigned to a button. And we're also going to need something to reset the game. So let's just create 2 buttons to fulfill those 2 objectives. And I'm not trying to make these look good or anything. Let's just to test out functionality. Okay, so we've got our 2 buttons on here. Let's just assign our macro to the first one for guessing. So this will be make guess. We then need a new game function in the code to be able to assign. So let's have a look at that now. Okay, so let's have a sub of new game. And all we need to do for a new game is to clear out our result grid and our guess grid. We also will want to generate a new word, which we've not seen how to do yet, so we'll come to that afterwards. And we also want to be able to reset our row to number 9. So let's add in the bits that we can do at least. So let's say we'll set this, we're going to say, okay, calcs.range, and we know it's H9, dot value equals 9. And then we want to clear our grids. So this will be calcs.range, and the first grid is A9 to E14. We can just say clear contents, and then we'll copy that, and it'll be exactly the same for A19 to A24. So let's just check that this works. I'm just going to hit F5 within this new game sub to see, and there we go, it's reset the game as we want it. The final thing to do will be to get a new word, which we'll look at next. But before we do that, let's just check. We'll assign our macro new game. And let's just check now this is working. So if we go again with audio, we would click our guess button, and then we'd move down to row 10. And let's just, for timing, let's go into cloud, we'll guess, you win, okay, and then we can press new and it resets. So that all seems to be working fine. Right, so what we're going to need is a word list, essentially. So let's create a new tab. We'll just call this words. And I've just found a large list of 5-letter words online. I'll put these in here. So we've got over 3,000. Obviously, this is not all English 5-letter words, but it's a good chunk of them. So let's go back to our code. And let's just rename the sheet to be words in the code. So really, for getting a new word, what we want to do is we want a random number starting between the top of the list and the end of the list. And then we want to take that word and we want to paint it into our 5 squares on our calcs page. So we're going to need a few variables up here. Let's get the row of the word. Let's say the new word itself, which will be a string. And then I'm going to just use I as an integer. This will be used for counting when we're filling in the word on our calcs page. So first of all, to get a new word, let's get the random number. So we're going to say the row that we're looking for. For the random number for this, I'm just going to use the Excel functionality. So if I say application.worksheet function, and I'm going to use rand between. And this function in Excel lets you give a starting number and an ending number. Let's just, for argument's sake for now, put 3,000 in. And it will give us a random number between these two numbers, inclusive of these numbers. Now, rather than 3,000, we want to check how long our word list is. We don't really want to put a static number in here because it could change. We may add or delete words. So let's make it dynamic. To do that, what we're going to do is we're going to reference the sheet words, and we're going to look at the property called used range. And from there we can say rows.count. And that effectively will see what range you've used on the sheet in question, and it will count the number of rows. So this should now give us a random number between 1 and 3,000, whatever it was. Let's have a look. 3,103. And to check that's working, what we can do is just output this. I'm just going to copy this into the immediate window. And if I say debug.print and then paste this, let's just run it a few times. So 2278. 2706, 106. Okay, so that seems to be working fine. We now want to set our new word to equal whatever is in column A on that row. So again, it will be words.range, and here we can say A and our row word. So that will give us our word. And just a quick note on how I'm referencing cells here because I'm doing things interchangeably. Saying the range with the range letter followed by the number is exactly the same as using the cells reference that we used earlier. So this would be exactly the same as saying new word equals words.cells. The only difference is cells takes in the row first and then the column as a number. So that takes in two numbers. So these two lines are exactly the same thing. Cells is much more useful for looping through things because both of these arguments that it takes in are numbers. So you can easily kind of do +1 to loop through things. Whereas range, as you can see, takes in a letter. It's a little bit easier to see exactly what you're doing just by reading the statement. And that's why by default, I'll sometimes use this instead of the cells, but really you can use either. They are interchangeable. Okay, so now we're going to have our new word stored. And finally, we want to output it to our calcs tab. So we want to put it in here. So we're going to have to take it letter by letter and output it to this tab. So to do that, this is where we're going to use our integer. So we'll say for I equals 1 to 5, because that's how many columns there are. We want to say calcs, and this is an occasion where I'm going to use cells because I want to loop the columns. So we know it's on row 4, and the column that we're going to output to is going to be our I integer. So we can say the value is going to be equal, and now we want to take letter by letter here. And there are a number of ways to do this, but the way I'm going to very quickly do it, let's just imagine if we say, okay, the left characters of new word for the number we're on, what this will do is this will take, so the first time through, if we're working with the word cloud, for example, left of new word or left of cloud 1 will just give us C. And then when it goes through to number 2, it will give us CL. And then when it goes to number 3, it will give us CLO. So it's giving us the left number of characters of this new word. So if we just want to take one of those characters, each time we want to take the rightmost character. So when we've got C, the rightmost character is C. When we've got CL, the rightmost character is L. When we've got CLO, the rightmost character is O. So to take the rightmost character of this, we're going to say right, and then at the end, 1. So really that should now work. Let's go back out. We've already assigned our new game functionality to new. Let's see what happens. Okay, it does work. So we've got games, stews, bliss, pairs, etc. Now, the only other thing to do, because that writing looks a bit small and we've done everything in caps so far, let's just convert this to uppercase. So to do that, when we take this new word, we're just going to wrap this with the uppercase function. So now let's go back and say new, and it works perfectly. One thing we've not tested yet is the lose game functionality. So let's just very quickly, and I'll speed this up to check that the lose game is working correctly. Okay, so this is the final time. Obviously you wouldn't play a game like this, but guess, and we get you lose because you're at the end of the game. And then we'd have to click new to reset. And that all seems to be working fine. So really at this stage we have our backend complete. We're able to generate new words, we're able to input words on the grid, and we're able to deliver results in terms of a win or a lose for the player. Now obviously a player would not use this screen will be completely hidden behind the scenes, but the actual mechanics of the basics of the game are now fully done. We just need to make this look like Wordle. Okay, so I think that's where we're going to leave it today. In the next part, we will look at creating the UI and making this look like Wordle. I'll get that up as soon as possible. If you've got any comments or questions, then please put them below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you would like to be notified as soon as the next part is available. I'll see you next time.